Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. In December, the government shamefully pulled the meaningful vote on her deal, with a promise that the Prime Minister would secure legal assurances from the EU that the backstop would be temporary. The Leader of the House confirmed this, saying the Prime Minister is determined to get the legal reassurances that members want to see. While the Foreign Secretary told us the Prime Minister would find a way to win tomorrow's common vote by getting assurances with legal force that the Irish border backstop is only temporary. On receiving this letter today, to the Prime Minister from the President of the EU Commission and the Council, it must now be clear to all members across this House, yet again, the Prime Minister has completely and utterly failed to do that. Today's letter is nothing more than a repetition of exactly the same position that was pulled more than 1 month ago. It categorically does not give the legal assurances this House was promised and contains nothing but warm words and aspirations. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that absolutely nothing has changed from the Attorney-General's letter of advice to the Cabinet? His advice, which the government tried to hide, explained with great clarity the reasons why the UK could find itself locked into the Northern Ireland backstop protocol with no legal escape route. Today's letter means nothing. The truth remains that by the end of 2020, the UK will face a choice of either extending the transition period, which comes at an unknown financial cost, or we will fall into the backstop, which the Attorney-General has said endures indefinitely until such time as an agreement supersedes it. He has himself updated his legal advice today, as the Prime Minister just said, and he clearly says, and I quote, "They do not alter the fundamental meanings as he advised them in November." If there were legally binding assurances on the temporary nature of the backstop, then surely they would have been written into the withdrawal agreement itself. The letter published this morning is clear that this is not possible, saying we're not in a position to agree to anything that changes or is inconsistent with the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, this morning's joint letter does say negotiations can start as soon as possible after the withdrawal from the UK. But my question to the Prime Minister is, how is that possible when the Cabinet cannot agree it amongst themselves? That is why the political declaration is so vague. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I believe the right word is nebulous. Given the Prime Minister has failed to secure the promised changes, there can be no question of once again ducking accountability and avoiding tomorrow's vote. No more playing for time, no more running down the clock to scare people into backing this damaging shambles of a deal. I'm sure members across the House will not be fooled by what has been produced today. It's clear what we are voting on this week is exactly the same deal we should have voted on in December. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows this. That is why today she's trying to blame others for this chaos. Given the lack of support for the Prime Minister's deal, you might have thought she would try to reach out to MPs. Instead, the Prime Minister is claiming that by failing to support her botched deal, members are threatening to undermine the faith of the British people in our democracy. Mr. Speaker, the only people who are undermining faith in our democracy is the government itself. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no greater example of democracy in action than for this House to reject a deal that is clearly bad for this country. During the past 2 years of shambolic negotiations, the Prime Minister has failed to listen. She hasn't once tried to work with Parliament to construct a Brexit deal that this House and the country can support, and now she's left facing a humiliating defeat and is blaming everybody but herself. Mr. Speaker, if this deal is rejected tomorrow, and I hope it is, the blame will lie firmly with the government and firmly at the feet of the Prime Minister. There is a deal that could command support in the House, which would include a new and comprehensive customs union, a strong single market relationship, and a guarantee to keep pace with European Union rights and standards. Instead, the Prime Minister still chooses to take the most reckless path. Mr. Speaker, as we enter the week of the meaningful vote, we should remember the meaningful vote only happened because of pressure from the opposition in this House. Let us remember the incompetence we've been forced to endure. We've seen 2 years of shambolic negotiations, red lines announced, then cast aside. We're now on our third Brexit secretary, all of whom have been largely excluded from the vital stages of the negotiations. We were promised the easiest trade deal in history, yet we've seen a divided government deliver a botched withdrawal deal with nothing more than a vague outline for what our future relationship with the EU will be. Meanwhile, conditions in this country of millions of people continue to get worse. We just had an urgent question about universal credit and the disaster that is for millions of people in this country. Mr. Speaker, the government is in disarray. It's clear if the Prime Minister's deal is rejected tomorrow, it's time for a general election. It's time for a new government.
I'll get that little piece of dandruff off.